Are you considering a sale of your company to a private equity firm, but not sure whether or not that makes sense? Maybe you've seen other videos or commentators that say like Warren Buffett, like private equity is a scam, or like don't sell to private equity. Well, in this video, I'm going to touch on some of the most frequently asked questions that people have around selling to a private equity fund, and hopefully show you why selling to a private equity fund might be a great idea, or in some cases a terrible idea. Let's dive in. So first of all, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what a private equity fund is and what they do. So private equity funds go and buy companies. They buy companies typically with a certain amount of leverage, debt, and their own equity. And then they use financial engineering primarily to drive great returns. They also will go in, hopefully, and improve operations of the business. They might roll it or merge it with another company. They do a lot of different things in order to make that company successful. The thing you have to realize about private equity is that sometimes private equity gets a real bad name, right? You think about the book Barbarians at the Gates and how ruthless KKR was in their acquisition of RJR Nabisco. Or you read about Toys R Us and how Bain Capital basically sunk the whole business. But the reality is that private equity is really not that risky most of the time. Private equity investors are buying businesses that frankly aren't that risky. Like they're generating strong profits on a consistent basis. They don't need to be growing a whole lot. And frankly, private equity investors don't need them to grow in order for them to generate like a very solid return on investment. The other thing is, like, private equity investors aren't looking to generate 10, 20x on their investments. They're looking to generate a more modest and reasonable 2 to 5x on their investments. What this means, though, is that if most of your investments are generating about a 3x return, you really can't afford to lose very many of your investments if you want to generate a good return for your investor. Because essentially, like, if I'm only generating 3x and I want to target a 3x total return on my fund, then I really can't afford to lose a single portfolio company, which means private equity is really not quite as risky as it sounds. But anytime there is like a big blow up, reporters are sure to jump on it and tear apart private equity as these greedy capitalists. Now, if you've decided that, now's the right time to sell your business, let's talk about a few reasons why selling to private equity might make sense. The first thing that I would recommend really understanding is, why is the private equity fund buying you? Are they buying you to roll your business up into another one, a larger platform, for example? Or are they buying you because you are the platform? Both have pros and cons. So let's say that you're the platform they want to buy, and then they're going to go buy other businesses and roll them in. Well, if that's the case, they're probably going to want you to stick around and roll some additional equity into the business. They're going to want you to be, at a minimum, an advisor, sometimes continue to operate in the CEO spot for a year or two, maybe sit on the board, etc. And frankly, if you're going to roll over a substantial amount of your equity, you might want to do that. Because in some cases, right, the private equity fund will come in, let's say your business is worth $100 million. They'll borrow like half of that in debt, and then they'll put up, 30% of it, and then they'll ask you to roll the remaining 20. So you're going to get a cash payout of $80 million, which, don't get me wrong, that's a good day. But then they're going to want you to roll another $20 million over it. Well, they're only putting up $30 million, and then they're going to laden the company with a ton of debt. So, it does kind of put at risk that $20 million. The flip side is, if you really believe that most private equity funds are pretty decent at their job and don't lose money, and actually are effective at growing the investment and generating a good return, rolling some equity may not be a bad thing, because you could still be somewhat involved in the business and it gives you a second bite of the apple. I mean, I know situations where the entrepreneur sold the company for one number, took a huge check home, and then the private equity fund and them together working side by side brought a ton of resources and expertise to the business and doubled it from there. So they got another bite at the apple that was almost as big as the original capital that got paid out the first time the private equity fund came in to buy it. So it actually can be, I think in most cases, a very positive thing to roll equity, because you get this big chunk and now you're set, and then you get a second bite that could be totally life-changing for like your kids and their kids and so on and so forth. The flip side though is maybe they're not buying you to be the platform. Maybe they're buying you to be the roll-up. So in that case, they probably don't want you to stick around unless you want to stick around and have a job working for them. In that case, they probably are just essentially buying market share. So they'll buy your business and they'll bolt it on to a much larger company, probably a company that you view as one of your biggest competitors. And what they're trying to do is, if they start with a solid business and they go out and they buy a lot of small, even smaller businesses and bolt them on and make it bigger and bigger and bigger, then what happens is the business kind of conglomerate, if that makes sense, this new monster they've put together becomes hopefully stronger, better margins because you've got more scale, so you've got more negotiating power when it comes to, buying from suppliers and so forth. It's less risky because it's a bigger business, and so, investors, all things being equal, will pay more for less risk, and it gets big enough that larger private equity funds start to become interested in it, because what you have is multiple tiers of private equity funds. And as private equity funds get bigger and bigger and bigger, they can't really justify doing smaller deals. And so they're reliant on smaller middle market funds to go out, find platforms, do add-ons, build it up so it's big enough, and then sell it upstream to the larger private equity funds. That's a very common strategy. The nice thing though is that if you just want out of your business and you want to be done, you're ready to sit on the beach, then if you're selling it and it's part of a roll-up, you can kind of like sell it and walk and not necessarily have any further obligations with the company. In some cases though, like a very popular thing is to do dental roll-ups. So for example, maybe it's a dentist that doesn't really love like the business side of what they do. They love helping people, they love working on teeth, but they don't love like the politics and the bickering and the payroll and all of the headaches that come along with running a business. And so in many cases, like they'll sell their practice to a private equity fund. They continue to work in the business. They get paid a very nice salary and they drastically reduce the stress in their lives. So in those cases, like it can be great because you can offload a ton of stress while still getting paid really, really well. And so there are a lot of roll-up strategies like that in the healthcare space, whether it's dental or primary care docs or all kinds of things. So what can you expect if you're going through the process? Well, oftentimes private equity funds will reach out and they'll be interested in learning more about your company. What does the process look like? Well, first, you got to engage with a private equity fund, and that typically happens in one of two ways. Either you reach out or get contacted by an investment bank, and that investment bank represents you on your behalf, and they go out and meet with a lot of private equity funds that they have relationships with, and they show them your deal, and then they become kind of your intermediary. They help you negotiate the whole deal back and forth, and they can be great advisors as you're working through this whole process. If your business is big enough to justify it, typically, a business that's worth at least $10 to $20 million, it's probably worth spending some of your money working with an investment banker, just like you would work with a realtor if you wanted to sell your house, because a realtor can help you get a better price ultimately than you can get on your own. That said, sometimes private equity funds will reach out to entrepreneurs directly, and the entrepreneur doesn't use an investment bank, but rather just works directly with the private equity investor. That can also work really well. Private equity investors love that because there's less fees that they have to pay and less fees you have to pay. But the flip side is, there is certain value to having somebody that's been there, done it a whole bunch of times in the form of an investment banker to advise you and hold your hand through the process. Once you meet with them and they decide, hey, this is a really interesting deal, they'll oftentimes issue a term sheet or a letter of intent or what have you, and then start the diligence process. In the diligence process, they're going to spend a bunch of time understanding market, competition, those types of things that are external to your business, but they'll also spend a lot of time in your business. So understanding the financials, the operations, the team, the managers, all of those different aspects of your company to ensure that they know what they're getting into and that it's ultimately a good deal for them and for you, frankly. During that due diligence process, and even as it comes to the end, you'll spend a lot of time negotiating back and forth on the terms of the deal. They may find things in diligence that cause them to want to argue for a lower valuation, or in many cases, the market might change and you might be pushing for a higher valuation as you learn more about what's going on during this whole process. Some of the key factors to think about, though, in the negotiating process is not just the amount they're going to pay you. Especially if you've got employees that you really care about in the company, you wouldn't want them to come in necessarily and just fire everybody. And so sometimes that can be a lever, like, hey, I'm willing to sell, but I want my employees taken care of, right? And in that case, it's as much as on you to negotiate as it is on you to do your due diligence on the private equity firm to make sure that they stand behind their word and won't fire everybody once you've exited the business. There are other levers too that can matter. So maybe you negotiate how much you have to roll over into the deal, or maybe you negotiate the timing of when payouts occur. Sometimes you'll have earnout strategies or components to the deal where they say, hey, this is a great business, we'll pay you what you want, but we're not going to pay you all of it up front. We need to make sure that, everything you told us is really true, and the only way to really know that is for us to wait a year or two and see how the performance is over that time period, right? Like, if we buy the business and then overnight lose half the contracts, that's going to be a problem, right? And that's probably something you as the founder and operator of the business have some insight into, right? So they do a lot of things to try to protect themselves there. And then, of course, like, valuation is definitely a key sticking point, right? You want to get the most you can out of the business. And look, I think if you're looking to sell, I think it makes sense if you're basically ready to hang up the spurs, or you're looking for a partner that can really help take you to the next level. If you're really happy in your business, you're generating good cash flows, you're pocketing meaningful dividends every year, that's a pretty good reason not to sell, right? Unless you're just really tired of it and you're ready to go sit on the beach. What happens after you sell the company? Let's say that you didn't just sell the whole thing and now you're sitting on the beach enjoying a martini or a pina colada. Let's say the private equity fund required you to roll over some of your equity and they want you to stay in the business for a year or two. What can you expect? Well, you should probably be focused on finding your replacement and helping support and build the management team to operate in your absence. And you're probably going to be locked up for somewhere in the range of, 2 to 5 years as the private equity fund works through their strategy. Whether it's, hey, we're going to bring manufacturing overseas and reduce costs, and then we're going to sell it once that's settled, or we're going to start rolling up similar businesses to yours, and then once we get to a certain size, we're going to sell it off. So really understanding like what the private equity fund's ultimate strategy is for your business and how long it's going to take them to pull that off, and the risks that are associated will be important to understanding what your life will be like post-sale. But for the most part, a lot of people I know that have sold their businesses spend a lot of time continuing to work in the business, mentor the management team, be an advisor, find their replacements, et cetera, and ultimately strategize with the private equity firm, which if you partner with the right PE firm, can be like a huge blessing because they can bring a tremendous amount of resources and knowledge to help the business really get to that next level, ensuring that not only they generate a good return, but you do as well on the equity you rolled. There are a lot of reasons to sell to a private equity firm. Usually it has to do with, you're ready for the next adventure, whether it's retirement or starting something new. There can be some definite downsides. Sometimes private equity funds do come in and lay off a ton of staff and make a bunch of changes that you don't really appreciate or agree with. It can also be scary to hand over kind of your baby and your reputation to a private equity firm that is definitely going to be more financially first-minded than you were as you were building it. That said, I hope this video was helpful in terms of helping you understand what the process looks like and some of the pros and cons of selling to a private equity firm. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my other videos such as what kind of businesses do private equity investors buy to determine whether or not your business is one they would find attractive.